The He-Man and the Masters of the Universe toy line has something of a checkered past. It's been the most powerful toy line in the universe at the height of its existence, faded into obscurity for years after, and resurged to bring collectors some joy in modern times. But which MOTU line is the best? We'll talk about it right here on Toy Kennections. Let's begin. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name's Ken, your host for, I guess, every video that goes on in this channel. And what I wanted to do today was discuss the greatness of Masters of the Universe and the various toy line options that we have. But I'd also like to pose a question to the audience about which toy line of Masters of the Universe do you collect? And by extension, which one do you think is the best? The reason why I thought to bring this up is the recent resurgence of Masters of the Universe in the 2020s has let us look back at the previous toy lines and examine them a little bit more closely. Now, obviously, Masters of the Universe got its start during the vintage era in the early to mid 1980s before riding off into the sunset after the movie in 1987, and of course coming back with the New Adventures of He-Man a couple years later on, although that's not a discussion for today because the New Adventures of He-Man really is its own topic. Now, many people obviously started with Masters of the Universe vintage toys as their original line. They didn't have another choice, and a lot of people will simply look at that as the peak and quintessential MOTU toy line, simply because of the innocence of the toys at the time and the other toys that were on shelves during that period in the 1980s, as well as the fact that it just takes them back to their childhood. The toys were more simplistic. You didn't have other options for MOTU figures as there weren't 3 or 4 simultaneous toy lines out there at the same time. And at the end of the day, when you look at it with respect to other toy lines of that era, it just brings that tingling feeling of nostalgia. In many ways, and this goes for any toy line, some collectors will just feel that nothing beats vintage toys. So if you're one of those who only collects vintage MOTU, or you think that that is the absolute best MOTU line ever, do put that in the comment section below. I certainly collected vintage MOTU back in the day, back as a kid. I've slowed down that collecting over the recent years, but I have not just a respect, but a fondness and a memory for that toy line and what it's done in the history of toys overall, and with it being part of that rising tide of 80s cartoons, toys, and comic books. Don't forget the mini comics that were packed in with those toys. They're a little underrated. Some people will also like the 2000X line of toys that was based on the Mike Young Productions cartoon series. Now, that line of figures was a bit sleeker in design. There were some new character choices. Not everyone looked exactly like they did back during the vintage era of toys. For me personally, I like that cartoon more so than I like the toys themselves. I'm not 100% sure how to put my finger on it, but I just never gravitated towards that toy line. However, some of you out there might be a huge fan of that 2000X Mike Young Productions Masters of the Universe toy line. And if you are, I'd love for you to comment in the comment section below and let me know what you think about that particular toy line. Obviously, Prince Adam and He-Man look cosmetically different than they did compared to the vintage era of Masters of the Universe. Obviously, the Snake Men played a much bigger role in that series, and there was much bigger backstories for characters such as Skeletor, King Randor, King Grayskull, Teela and the Sorceress, you name it. Now, again, I'm not 100% sure why, but I'm not a big fan of these toys. I don't think they've aged that well over the years, but those who did collect the 2000X series back in the early 2000s will have fond memories of getting back into Masters of the Universe during that time. So again, let me know what you think of that toy line. Now we potentially get to the toy line I consider the best for Masters of the Universe, and that would be the MOTU Classics toy line. Now, what I've always liked about the MOTU Classics toy line is that it's in that 6.5, almost 7-inch scale, and I like that it scales with other toys that are either made by Mattel or could work with that toy line if you were to do some sort of crossover. Now, obviously, the Mattel WWE Elite series of toys is very similar in scale and basically identical in scale to the Masters of the Universe Classics line of figures. The Super 7 Thundercats, Super 7 Ninja Turtles, all scale with that toy line. I just love the work done by Four Horsemen Studios. And yes, obviously they did work for Mattel before, and even McFarlane even before that. But for me, the Masters of the Universe Classics line is where I really became aware of the Four Horsemen Studios' work as far as their sculpting, their design, their innovation is concerned. And obviously the Four Horsemen Studios have come back and made a big thing out of Mythic Legions. It's now got its own Legions Con. So kudos to those gentlemen who are behind that Mythic Legions toy line, and the fact that they really did a lot to rise to fame during the Classics era. Again, what I love about the Masters of the Universe Classics figures is that not just the creativeness of the sculpts, but because they take the aesthetic of the vintage Masters of the Universe figures and they modernize them, they give them more articulation. Like I said, the scale and proportions are really good. Some of the accessories are nicely packed in, and they give a wide range of accessories that give you lots of options for display. They did a lot to expand the lore of the franchise. That's the big one there. All the various He-Man that I've covered on my He-Man of History video, a video that you can check out whenever you get a chance. And just the expansion of concept characters, fan write-in characters, multiple versions of characters, more army builder options. There was just a lot going for the Masters of the Universe Classics line. Now, maybe you disagree with me. Maybe the Masters of the Universe Classics line is something that hasn't aged well for you. For me, it's aged wonderfully. Unfortunately, pricing on the secondary market has gone really high for Masters of the Universe Classics. So even if you agree that it's the peak of Masters of the Universe in terms of its toys, at the same time, they're harder to get, especially if you get a sealed sample that you can now think of as semi-vintage, or at least the early retro modern stuff. It'd be hard to open that packaging if you find a sealed example, not just because of the value, but because it's a bit of a mental hurdle. A few years ago, I opened the Masters of the Universe Classics figure, and it was hard for me to wrap my mind around getting that package open. Let's just say it took a little bit of liquid courage in order for me to summon the bravery needed to open up that packaging. But that's just me. That may not be all of you. So let me know your thoughts in the comments about Masters of the Universe Classics as a toy line as well. We then move towards more modern times, and you can go in one of two directions, or you can go in both directions if you like. There's the Masters of the Universe, well, Masterverse line, as well as the Masters of the Universe Origins line of figures. And the Masterverse line is probably the closest that they have to Classics today. A lot of the characters that are being made in Masters of the Universe Masterverse, in terms of that toy series, I have a lot of those characters already in the Classics toy line. So for me, unless it's a character that's something like Sunman that wasn't released before in the past, that's a figure that I'd be willing to buy and have already purchased in my Masterverse line, and I display it with my Classics figures. But for some of you, maybe you missed the Classics line when it came out, and Masterverse has given you a second kick at the can to get that scale of figures. Though, to be fair, those figures scale just a tiny bit taller than the Classics figures, but they still fit well together. Yes, there's a design aesthetic that differs because the Four Horsemen Studios is no longer involved in Masters of the Universe. So that may be, I don't know if it's a deal breaker for you or if you appreciate the present day sculpting. I do appreciate it, but like I said, I've already got a collection that fills that gap as far as I'm concerned and for the purpose of my own toy collection. But the good thing about the Masterverse toy line is they can continue to expand that lore. We've seen different versions of King Grayskull. We've seen different versions of multiple characters that you didn't see in Classics. So it can work out quite well for you to collect that line if that's your bread and butter. Finally, we get to Masters of the Universe Origins. And among the circles I run in, this is the most popular line that's talked about among my friends. Masters of the Universe Origins rides that fine line between looking somewhat vintage but still looking somewhat modern, and it can be hard to be both at the same time, but it's one of those rare lines that does it. Because of the scale of the figures, because of the extra articulation in the knees, it feels like that they ride the vehicles and the steeds in the vintage line better than the originals. You can take a Masters of the Universe Origins figure, you can stick it into a vintage vehicle, or you can have it ride a vintage Battlecat or a vintage Night Stalker or Strider or Panther or whatever. So that's why most of my friends they find it to be the most versatile line. It scales with your vintage Masters of the Universe figures and adds a little bit extra detail, articulation, just a little extra polish. The figures stand better because they're not based on leg bands that could snap or break at any time. And also, even if you were only a vintage Masters of the Universe collector, it's possible that you would get characters like Wundar or the aforementioned Sunman that I mentioned earlier to fit in with your vintage figures. You might have gotten an Eternia and you think Modi looks good with your vintage collection. That's totally okay too. In fact, that could be a way to collect. Maybe you are a vintage only Masters of the Universe collector, but you also grab characters from the Origins line in order to fill character gaps that existed, or just use it to expand the range of your figures in the vintage line. Or maybe you're just one of those people who collects anything Masters of the Universe, and every line I mentioned here has representation to a wide degree in your collection. Maybe you love vintage, 2000X, classics, Masterverse, Origins, Masters of the WWE Universe, minifigures, the Super 7 smaller figures that scale with the Origins and vintage figures. That's another one to consider as well. The limited time Super 7 license that they had, Masters of the Universe, where they released characters such as Shadow Weaver that a lot of people have put into their vintage collections. I've seen that as well, and if you collected that line, do put that in the comment section below as well. You'll notice I didn't really touch on the Masters of the Universe CGI series, as I think that targets a different audience and just feels like a different cartoon and a different toy line altogether. And I didn't touch that much on the New Adventures of He-Man, and it's because of the fact that I think those serve different audiences, more niche audiences, or just different audiences altogether. So I tried to stick, for the purpose of this discussion, to the Masters of the Universe characters and their appearances as they're represented across the multiple toy line options. So are you a vintage collector? Are you a modern collector? Do you like a little bit of everything? Do you agree with Ken in that Masters of the Universe Classics is the best? Or do you lean towards Masterverse, Origins? Do you go back to vintage? Whatever it happens to be. I'd love to hear from all of you in the comment section below. Anyway, thank you to the Patreon supporters and channel members whose names can be found in the description section below. You can become a patron yourself by visiting patreon.com/toykennections, and you can unlock some perks and other benefits, or click the join button next to my channel name to get some badges and emojis for your use in the comment section of any Toy Kennections video or live stream. If you enjoyed this video, don't go anywhere just yet. You can click on another Masters of the Universe video by clicking right over here, or you can click on another toy history video by clicking right over here. And with that, I'll see you again soon with some more of my favorite toys. Thanks again, and take care.